always think that this was a book I was gonna write. But in 2019, my grandfather passed away pretty suddenly from cancer, and one of the last things he said in his deathbed was, "Don't sell the land." And I'd always grown up with access to that land, but I had lived in New York, so my main existence was this more just on the outskirts of New York City, life in Long Island, and every summer and for Thanksgivings and for funerals or just because holidays, we'd go to North Carolina. And so the land was this constant in and out of the life, you know. When we were down there, it was running around barefoot, it was swimming in lakes, it was being taught how to fish, and it was beautiful and but it was always in doses. But when my grandfather passed away and said that, it really made me want to invest more in this thing at the time that I'm thinking of it as this thing that he cared so much about. And so my version of that was a lot of genealogical history to understand. I knew that there had been land that he had bought with his retirement money, and I knew that there had been land that he had inherited. And I wanted to understand the story of all of the land and why it mattered to him so much. And in uncovering it, realizing that, you know, at present day we have about 92 to 96 acres of land in North Carolina, but in like less than a century ago, my family owned 600 acres of land. And the first of those acres were just under 350 acres born 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And so learning that and seeing the deed records and holding the deed books in my hand made everything feel more real and made me understand the legacy behind it, but also that the history of Black people in this country has been working land that has been really hard for us to ever own or profit from. It's just like back-breaking labor on land, and yet often doing it as a sharecropper or as a landowner who is not being given, you know, the fair advantage to actually compete in this economy, or who had their land taken from them. You know, I like, whereas I grew up with access to our land, I also knew a lot of Black families in New York who their story was, oh, I thought we used to have land, or I think my grandmother's from, and not really knowing and being connected to that. And so that's when it starts to turn into this, I don't want to just collect the genealogical history for my family. I think there's a larger project here about expanding our vision of what the racial justice movement looks like, recognizing that more than 55% of Black people live in the South, and even more live in suburbs and rural areas in the Midwest and the North, even in New York. And reclaiming that and owning that history and not internalizing shame, but recognizing that tending to land is beautiful. Being exploited in your labor on land is what's not. And so I wanted to reject the shame that made me not feel connected to nature or the natural environment, while pushing back against a lot of the theft and dispossession that's happened on the land. And that's how Rooted came to be.
Can you talk about how you approached research? Because it seems like a balance of like really deep reading and thinking and looking in archive, but also oral histories and interviews.
Yeah, it definitely started with the oral history and the interviews, because also, again, it was a place to connect to my grandfather, and so I first started with interviewing his living siblings. My grandfather is one of 18 children, which is also very common of farming Black families at the time. You have large families because your children are your labor force, and so that was definitely my grandfather's experience before he migrated north during the Great Migration. And so I interviewed a lot of his living siblings, you know, many of them still are, getting what they could recall and then using records to corroborate what they had said. Also because I just feel like a lot of the archives that I was being pointed to were very white dominated in the framing of them. For example, like one of the best archives, which I do still love but I have a lot of critiques of, is the Federal Writers Project's Slave Narratives Initiative. I saw a lot of nodding heads, so maybe I don't need to explain it, but a lot of the interviewers who were sent down into the South to interview these formerly enslaved, now elders at the time, were white. And so some of the interview responses reflect that. I mean, I'm literally looking at transcriptions where someone's being asked, what was your experience being enslaved? And they're like, my massa was good. And it's like, I don't trust that this person was not coerced or didn't feel coerced, you know? Even if the person interviewing them really earnestly wanted their honest answers, they weren't going to give it based on the time that this was being done. This was being done in the midst of Jim Crow. This is 1930s and 1940s, that white people are going into the South and interviewing people who had been enslaved and asking them to be honest. And that wasn't gonna ever happen. And so I wanted to balance archives like that, which some of the interviewers were people like Zora Neale Hurston, so some of those interviews were more substantive, but I wanted to balance archives like that with oral history that is considered unreliable at times, but is the most reliable as far as the emotional points, what it felt like for Black families. For example, in the research I did on Wilmington, North Carolina, which is where the Wilmington Massacre happened in 1898, there have been lots of studies on the massacre, and local city acknowledges it as a massacre, and yet they still to this day insist that land theft was not a part of it. When all Black oral history from the day describes deed records being burned, people being held at gunpoint, pushed out of their homes, and white families moving in the midst of the violence. And so it's like, if I'm only going off of records that are official and that have formal citations, I don't get the story of the grandchild who says, we never go back to that state because, right? And like, that is still important. Even if the dates are wrong, even if the birthdays are not right, even if I can't get a census record to confirm it. You know, my grandmother didn't get a birth certificate till she was 9, but her story and her perspective is still valid. So it was a lot of oral history, and where I could corroborating that, but where I couldn't, just naming that and just saying, this is what the family says, and there are lots of reasons for why we might not be able to corroborate that, but I choose to really trust and lean on the oral history which is passed down because it's just as valid.
I've been doing family research for several years, but for a particular project I'm working on that has to do with my 3 times great-grandfather who, the family lore is that he had 60 children, and that he owned land, and that he maybe had a white servant who lived in their house before he voted in elections before the Civil War. But I can't find official records that match it, and so I'm fascinated by the difference in the kind of memories and the kind of histories, and what does it mean that we can't find it? Because it feels like the archive is it is a political space.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a neutral space. It has really been controlled by white institutions, by the sort of the ways that they're organized, by the ways that white imagination organizes our information.
Yeah, I love that you said that though, but it is very political, and the choices that writers make and researchers make, and then readers even. Like, I think what readers or media critics choose to see as valid or legitimate also matters, and what people poke holes in definitely matter. I'm lucky enough though that I come from a family of historians, and it's still informal in the sense of like a lot of the records that I ended up leaning on were like family reunion books, right? And like they're like these just it's mind blowing to me to think of the main one that I used as research was one from 1993. In the 1990s, family members of mine, unpaid labor, just choosing to curate this history, bind it, and print enough copies out for the family. And in these family reunion books, and I actually have it on my phone, so I can grab it and pull it up. But it starts with in 1619, and I'm like reading this like, this is so cool. In 1993, they're talking about in 1619, and that's how the family reunion book opens. And then a few stanzas down, it says, you know, Brea Baker in 1880s so-and-so bought this much land, and if you go to the Franklin County Register of Deeds, ask for deed book number 63, page this, you will find it. And so having access to the family reunion book, even though the family reunion book itself is not something that I would be able to formally cite, but it pointed me towards the formal records.
Right,
so I'm really lucky that the oral history and the zines were still connected to formal records, and then I was able to find things that were not cited in the book, but because they'd already pointed me towards things.
Right.
And that was really beautiful for me, because I'm just like I just constantly ask myself, like, why? Like, why would they do that? Like, the research I was doing was in service of a book that, like, thankfully I had an advance for and I have funding to do
Right.
research for, but like, on their own time, it was important enough.
Yeah.
And I think that is also another reason why I just never discredit oral history. Even the lore that's a little silly sounding is sometimes not. Like,
Right.
in my family reunion book, it also says that there were multiple different wives, and it was clear that, like, families were separated and you just had more kids with more people, and so
Right.
there were a lot of Lewis's children that benefited from the land that he bought with his first wife. And I come from the line of the second wife, actually. And so even that was just like things like that I never would have known about a Nancy because I come from a Nellie. But because the family reunion book honors both
Right.
wives and both lineages and the purchases that they made together and names these people, because even like wives were not named on the deeds.
Right.
So like I know that they did it together because the family reunion book does,
Right.
but on the formal papers it says Lewis Baker and wife, literally and wife. So just all of the ways that the illegitimate archive actually gives more color and more dignity to all of the parties involved than the formal records ever would or could, is also another reason why I'm just like, why would I hold that on a pedestal and discredit all of the beautiful curative work that my ancestors did,
Right.
and that I could not do this research without someone caring enough to go to Staples or wherever they went
Right.
to like personally bind these books. It's so beautiful. So I'll make sure to share the photos of that with y'all after.
And I'll find my family.
Yeah, see, and that's normal. Family reunion books are the T-shirts with the
Yeah.
family trees on the back. Yeah,
Totally, yes.
thank you. Yeah.
I have so many things I want to ask you about. I was wondering, so I was thinking maybe we could talk about Indigenous Black solidarity or collectiveness, or the ways we're in conflict with each other. Just where we are right now is there's a passage around Calhoun in the book, and this neighborhood used to be, Lake area used to be named for Calhoun, but is now named Damacosta because it's really returned to its ancestral name. But I wonder about, there's many points in the book that you talk about the ways in which Black folks and Indigenous people have lived together, or the ways in which we've been pit against each other. I'm curious about that part of it.
Yeah. For me, I definitely knew that I could not write a book about land theft without talking about Indigenous Americans. And I think that there are tensions that exist, and I'm just someone who believes that we have to lean into the tension, because, I mean, even for selfish reasons, if I know that a hurdle standing in the way of reparations for Black people is this conversation around, but whose land first, or who, then I wanna have that conversation because I need us to get to the reparations for Black people. But even beyond that, to me, it just feels like true reparations for Black people is more than just cutting a check to individuals. True reparations, and I love the language that other countries have used, and not to say that these processes are perfect, but like places like South Africa use the terms truth and reconciliation. I love that because it centers that the point of it is to tell the truth about what happened and to repair the harm that was done. Like, that's the whole thing. Truth and reconciliation, truth and restitution, reparations, repair. Like, just remembering at the end of it is that if you cut the check and allow the myths and the narratives to still be that it was a handout, or that, this is reverse racism or whatever, that's not telling the truth. And to tell the truth about what happened to Black people, we have to start with the land that was taken, because the supply and demands fed each other. There would not have been continued land theft if there was not a successful way of bringing enslaved Black people to keep working it. If it was not profitable, if Black people were not producing on that land, it would have been a failed venture, and they would have traveled somewhere else to try it somewhere else. And if there wasn't enough land, if they were not successful at taking indigenous land, there wouldn't have been any land for Black people to work in. So it all feeds each other. So I'd be too zoomed in to only talk about part of the story and only be talking about Black people. I had to zoom out and say, we were only brought here because their land was stolen. And now that we are here and have worked this land and we're emancipated and freed into a world where the economy was dominated by agriculture, and the only option was to continue working the land. Hope you could own some, but if not, you were going to share crop or convict lease or otherwise continue to be subjugated. And like the compounds of that, like the grandchildren and great grandchildren of sharecroppers are still poor, live in food deserts, don't have good health outcomes, don't have the educational attainment, et cetera, and those are all offsprings and byproducts of this unresolved trauma and injustice and theft. And to repair anything to Black people, we also would have to do reparations and land back with Indigenous Americans. I just strongly believe that. I think land back necessitates reparations and vice versa, because how could I give reparations to Black Americans and not to, it just feels illogical to do one or the other. And Black and Indigenous people both come from cultures that recognize that there is an abundance of land. There has never been too little to go around. The hoarding mindset is what has been most toxic, but there's plenty to go around. We can do land back and reparations, and that doesn't mean that no other people can live in this country. Like, there's plenty of land to provide when we are not hoarding, when we are not building these conglomerates and forcing the farm workers and the laborers to do so at the expense of their livelihoods. So I talked about the tension, but also about the good, because I think there are so many positive examples of Black and Indigenous people getting that I just said. Maroon communities is like the furthest back historical example that I give of Black and Indigenous people freeing themselves and building separate civilizations outside of the eyes of these plantations. But even in more recent eras, Malcolm X was talking about freeing the land and was in community with Indigenous Americans. Angela Davis was going to Wounded Creek and to various different reservations. Dick Gregory, the famous Black comedian, was participating in fish-ins, which were Indigenous plays off of sit-ins at the lunch counters, but it was fish-ins because Indigenous fishers were being told that they were not allowed to fish on their ancestral lands, which is still a problem. So there's been so much of us coming together. There were tribes that enslaved, there were tribes that absolutely resisted, and so I think it's important to name all of it. And there have been times where Indigenous nations have been anti-Black, there have been times where Black people have been anti-Indigenous, and it's all been trauma responses to this larger system. And if we can get at the larger system, we don't have to be crabs in a barrel if we dismantle the barrel. This is kind of what I hoped that the book would get to.
I love the examples too of like trickster energy, the Lowry game.
Yeah.
I love the idea of people Robin Hooding for each other.
Yes.
Taking things back. I wonder about just sort of like if there are any initiatives happening right now that you know about that are exciting to you, that inspire you.
Yes, definitely. And I try to seed so many of those in the book because I think a book like this can feel very pessimistic and sad. And I try to balance that with the reminder that there has been so much resilience and there still is. One of the organizations that I love the most is Where's My Land? They are the organization behind the successful Bruce's Beach campaign. If y'all are familiar, the Black family in California that got their land returned to them after it was stolen through eminent domain. And that family has since had to sell the land back to the state, but at least they are getting a dollar amount for that land as opposed to it just being snatched from under them. And Where's My Land has dozens of active campaigns because after the success of that campaign, so many families flooded their email with, I have proof that our land was taken. And I think that's also such an important thing because one of the biggest, there's so many like misconceptions about reparations that keep us from the implementation and keep us in this constant study it, commission, task force stage. But one of the main ones is this idea of, well, there are no, none of the people alive now had the harm done to them. And that's so not true. Because reparations for the land thefts that I talk about, a lot of that happened in the 20th century. There are so many living people who had their land taken through eminent domain, through USDA discrimination that made them bankrupt, through heirs property law discrimination that broke up family farms. Like there's so many systematic ways. There are a lot of elders who never talk about those stories because it's traumatic and they believe nothing will be done about it. And the moment that there are these glimmers of hope of, wait, people are getting their land back. Okay, well, and now all of a sudden, grandma's pulling a crate out of the attic that's like, well, this is the proof, and like, and that's what I found in doing my genealogical history was a lot of families have these family reunion books, Bibles with inscriptions on the sides, notepads where people were keeping track at the times when they thought there was something that could be done, and then people give up and get jaded. But so Where's My Land is working to do the research and advocacy for families and get their land returned. They have active campaigns in places like Alabama where a family's land was taken through eminent domain because they said that the well on the land was poisoned water. The well is still in existence and providing water to nearby businesses, and the rest of the land is a parking lot for the University of Alabama. This family is still alive, still fighting for their land. So many similar stories like that, and so I think the work of Where's My Land is really important. There are also a lot of really cool efforts at like the intersection of racial, economic, and environmental justice. There are a lot of like land trusts and conservationist groups that would normally buy land and kind of hold the land almost the way that like the national parks do. And their whole idea is we need less land to be developed and we need more land to just exist and be wooded and keep ecosystems intact and all that good stuff. A lot of these organizations and land trusts though are white founded and white led, and they are starting to realize that maybe they are not the best ones to be the stewards, or that it should be more equitably shared. And so there's one in North Carolina that I love that they buy land and either sell it well under market value or lease it for free to Black and Indigenous farmers who will forage and fish and hunt on the land and still use it while also stewarding and taking care of it. There's so many projects like that in the Pacific Northwest and in California though too, and throughout the Midwest where nonprofits are starting to use money that is earmarked for climate justice initiatives and using these more like ancestral wisdom techniques. So there's a lot of really cool things that are happening, but I think what doesn't give me hope are the incessant studies. We're still at, is Congress studying this? Can the Ivy League universities study this? And it's like, you created the problem and now want to spend all of the money on studying it, that by the time you've figured out what the answer should be, we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on just the research. So
compensation for all these other things.
right,
Like, why is reparations so hard?
right, exactly. 100%. So no, please. We are an intimate space. Please, y'all. Like we can chat.
I think many of the examples in the book are from the South, and that makes total sense. But I wonder too about, Minnesota is this very specific kind of Scandinavian white space, and we, many farmers in Minnesota. Less than 1% of those farmers are people of color, and we have our own evidence and racist language within racial covenants within land deeds, and history of redlining for sure. And so I wonder about I really enjoyed the passage around the Great Migration and what is like lost in that, the connection to land and between communities is lost there. But I also wonder about the value of understanding our collective issues through this book, like for folks who live in a place like Minnesota, because Minnesota is a place where we have like very embarrassing levels of like Black folks don't own property in the same percentages as we should, and like lots of examples of the way the USDA has been pitting people against each other and using resources in a really poor way. So I wonder what you're looking into things in the North.
Yeah. No, that's so real. And this is actually a question where I'd love to like bring in folks like you, because I know that you do that work. But before I see if there's something you'd like to add, there is this Isabel Wilkerson quote from I think from The Warmth of Other Suns, where she says, "Geography couldn't save me." And I really love that quote because I think it was important to remember, like, we talk about redlining and we talk about the Great Migration, but I just feel like we have like isolated conversations about all of these things. And what I tried to do with the specific chapter on the Great Migration in this book was to get people to to see that violence was turning Black people from the South and from the Midwest into refugees, and they were fleeing for wherever the nearest train or bus would take them. And they were going to the West Coast, up north, places like this. States like Oklahoma are presenting itself as like safe havens, but then also being sites of violence. And so Black people are just like trying to find these enclaves of safety anywhere, and then end up in cities where they're being corralled into ghettos and also not allowed to own property. And so it's just, I just see the Great Migration as one big like period of theft. It was just like, if you lived in the South, we were taking your farmland. If you tried to go up north, we were gonna force you to be a renter. If you did happen to buy property, we were gonna make sure that you were redlined, and you were gonna do so with the most predatory rates possible, and you really had to have some money to make it happen. And if you were able to get around to all of those efforts designed to keep you from owning property, then eminent domain would take care of property. And it's just like, it was just everywhere you turned. Like, if you did everything right, if you kept your nose down and tried not to make a fuss and tried not to get too involved in politics, your land would still get taken. If you were too political, your land was definitely gonna get taken. And ultimately, a lot of people just like ended up being at some point disenfranchised and not even knowing that they ever owned land at any point. And so I don't know specifically what that looks like here, but I just know that that was happening everywhere. There was no state in the U.S. that was like safe for Black people, certainly at that time. And I think arguments can be made that there's still that truth now, but certainly then trying to build wealth as a Black person was just like trying to avoid landmines. And that's why we have less than 1% of farmland owned by Black Americans now, when 100 years ago that number was 14%. Still low compared to the rates of us working that land historically. But we have gone so far back, and yet 21st century is supposed to be like post-racial. And you know, Obama was president and Oprah's a billionaire, so there can't be inequity, but we own less than we did then, and racial wealth gaps are only widening. And it is all of those things happening at once that made it that way. It was, if you did come up with the money, you were going to be paying extra in your taxes, you were going to be paying extra in your interest. When it was time for you to sell your land, you were going to get less for it, and then it was going to be assessed less. And just constant ways of taking money and assets from us, and then saying that we were asking for handouts whenever we sought the same resources that everyone else was getting. Because while we were suffering like this, USDA is giving out money like it's nobody's business. Like, you get 10,000, you get 100,000, and you get $1 million, and so white families and corporations are getting rich off of these larger farming operations, while small family farms, specifically Black and Indigenous family farms, are going bankrupt. So I'm sure that was happening here.
Yes, I mean, so much. We have lots of farmers. I work Midwest Farmers of Color Collective. My wife and I have a farm. I have some of those stories in my family history. My dad's side, African American family, came from the South. Now they live in Harlem and the Bronx and stuff. They're like, I think we had land like back in our family, but we don't know what happened to it. Somehow now we don't. We never got a bunch of money to like if we sold it. But so I think there was some of that. But work with a lot of farmers in Minnesota, also Wisconsin and Iowa, who have stories of either, land theft and or, well, our family had land, we couldn't get any technical assistance or help from the USDA. We tried to go to the Farm Service Agency. They basically like ran us out of there. We tried to form a co-op. We couldn't get loans and things to like, so that your farm could be operational and you could be competitive. Because at the same time, like the USDA was just like not trying to help farmers, Black farmers, farmers of color at all. So like some people were like, if you did have land, you couldn't necessarily like put it into production or make it so that it would be successful and you could maintain it and keep it for a long period of time. And also, you know, just that we don't have wealth reserves, right? So if you have a bad year, it could be gone in
Yeah.
1 year. And just lots of examples of most people rent. We have 130 farmers in our organization, 78% of them rent. And so you're investing in land you don't own. And
Yeah.
then like, you know, we've got at least 7 or 8 farmers who, you know, worked on them for 2 or 3 years, invested compost and so much into the soil and everything, and then the landowner decided, well, I'm gonna sell it, and then you're just like down to nothing.
Yeah,
You're like, all the inputs, the labor, and all the things you put into it are gone,
yeah,
and it's such a, just like a terrible feeling that you feel like I can't get any traction in
Yeah.
this, you know?
Especially the kind of farming that black and brown farmers are doing in Minnesota, which
Yeah.
is like
Growing
sustainable growing food farming. And Minnesota is dominated by farmers who are growing fuel and they're growing feed and they're growing in ways that aren't healthy for communities or for the people that live around them. And so it's really discouraging that folks who want to grow farms that are biodiverse and are growing food for actual people and in small enough scale that they can't get the traction to do it.
Excuse
absolutely.
me, I know I'm late, but I just wanted, cause I came in on the part where you were saying, on what you were saying. And my grandfather told me a story. It's not about farming, but it's just about land and
Land,
ownership.
yeah,
And well, whatever, I'm gonna say it. But my grandfather told me that they own their house, they own their property. And he said he went to the bank and had a appointment, and the banker said, "Oh, that's all you paying right now?" And he went up on their rates. Yes, real true story.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous for somebody to think that they have that much power. You did.
And to be able to actually
Yeah.
act upon it and
Yeah.
that be what happens.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that he tried to figure out like, I gotta be able to report this,
Yeah.
right? But who do you report it to?
Exactly.
Yep.
They're gonna laugh you out. They're part of the people harassing you. You would never go to them in the first place. So it's just there's nowhere to turn when something like that happens to you. And that kind of stuff happens all the time, where renters get preyed upon, where first time home buyers are just know so little about the process, and you're just trying your best. And yeah, these HOAs can have specific, language that keeps you out, that says we do not sell to people from your background. And it could be real explicit, or it could be general, or it can use income caps. There are lots of creative
Yeah.
ways that it happens, but so it's not as easy as just finding the housing. And, it's mind blowing. And then to that point too, you're able to afford. Now though, that's money that could have been going into so many other things.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm sure he pulled the money together and kept y'all in the house or whatever happened, but it's still like that should have been money that was your disposable money. And to think of what could have, like, however long he had to pay that increase, whether that was an extra couple $100 a month, ends up being an extra couple $1,000 a year. And then over the course of decades, like where that money could go. And then you start to see how it compounds. So even with like the family in California, they got their land back thanks to this campaign. The land was taken through eminent domain in the 30s, I believe. And so they just get the land back. No money in addition to it. They used to have a hotel on that land that was torn down through eminent domain, and then the land just sat vacant. They don't get the monetary value of the building, but what they do get is a tax burden. Because the next year they have to pay taxes on $20 million worth of property that they just got back,
How
which
are you
should have been in
gonna
their
do that?
family, but now they have to. So people were very mad at the family because they sold it back to LA County. But it's like, were you gonna pay their taxes? That would have been a 6-figure tax burden, and now they would have been defaulting on the land and lost their land through the property tax. So there's all of these different ways where, even in trying to do right by a family, it's like still inadequate, because the reality is if that family was allowed to have that business go uninterrupted, they would have had, revenue coming in, they would have had an appreciating asset, they would have been able to make renovations and continue building. Their children and grandchildren would have been heiresses, not working class people advocating to get their money back and then having to sell it back to the county later. So there's so many slights that just add up and compound. And so then you realize that like any reparations policy that's put forth is such a discount on what it should be. Because reality is the land itself would have appreciated and quadrupled and just exponentially increased in value. But more than that, families would have grown up on land that would have been theirs. Like the public health impacts of that also. When you think of just what it means to go from growing up on land where you grew your own food, where your water came from your own well, to cities like Flint, cities like Newark, cities like Jackson, Mississippi, where the quality of air, water, soil are all horrible, but where you're concentrated. Like there's Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where it's the highest concentration of cancer rates because it's the highest concentration of factories that are putting out certain pollution, and it's a predominantly black neighborhood area.
They're red line
Yeah.
that way.
Absolutely. And then the thing is, when you live in a neighborhood like that, when you're born in a zip code like that, you can't just sell your house. No one wants to buy it because they know it's Cancer Alley. So the only people who live there are the children of people who couldn't afford to move away, are the grandchildren of people who couldn't afford to move away. And that's when you see the like generational, the intergenerational compounded harm that happens. So
We
Destruction.
we purchased this piece of land 4 years ago, 3 years ago, in a very like serendipitous way. This group of nuns had been running this retreat center on the land, and they wanted to retire, and they thought people of color should run this thing, and so they gave us this great deal that was like a contract for deed, so like a pay to own situation, and gave us the time to raise the money. But we really, in Minnesota, I think that the compelling thing in our fundraising campaign is like there are so many people in this that have not just one house, not just one piece of land, but they have cabins. Cabin culture is so big here. People go up north all the time, and it's one of the things that's really like not a possibility for most people of color. It's like something that they're closed on. Like everyone goes up north, and everyone's back here in the cities, not going up north. And we talked about the ways that the benefits of having that land, the benefits of being in nature, of having a relationship to a lake, a relationship to your family being different than they are back in the cities and in work mode.
yeah.
And like reflecting on that, we were able to raise over $2 million just in individual conversations with folks in order to purchase it outright within the first year. But it's been like incredible to own the land outright and not have to make decisions based on like how do we pay a mortgage, how do we keep on top of that sort of stuff, how do we host guests. We wanted to really center people of color and queer folks in retreating because it's most folks don't get to retreat in Minnesota. But it was nice to be able to not have to make the decisions around how much do we charge for a night on the land and like how do we make investment in order to make enough money to pay the mortgage. It's been really cool to be able to take that kind of slower and to be in a relationship and to not charge more.
And that's like what's needed, because the reality is that when you have a mortgage breathing down your back, especially for land of like multiple acres, then you start making unsustainable choices.
Right.
Then you start saying, I need the land to harvest this much, as opposed to, that's like not natural. Like, let's go at the rate that makes sense for this land, as opposed to forcing it to bear more than it can. And I think that's, again, it's like when you're tending land from a place of desperation, you're not remembering it's a living thing. You're not remembering that you can hurt it, and then that would then hurt you. And we're dealing with the ramifications of that. You know, my family's land is in northeast North Carolina. It's not right on the water, but it's supposed to be inland, but it is technically closer to the East Coast. And it used to be very protected because the Carolinas have what are called barrier islands that used to be swamps and marshes, and they protect from like hurricanes that are coming in, things of that nature. Well, now those barrier islands are golf courses and resorts. They're really flat. They are being maintained in ways that are just like not natural for those areas. They're below sea level now, and so they flood all the time. On top of the fact that hurricanes are getting harsher and harsher and harsher, now it floods all the time in the land, to the point where dams break. The lakes used to be there are not there anymore. Beavers and fish used to be there that cannot stay in the area because there is no body of water for them anymore. And I think there was a time in my life where that didn't seem like my problem. Like it was sort of like I have a lot of things to deal with, like you know, economic things, like you know, your family's trying to make ends meet, you're trying to get your life started, you know, all of the things that come up, that didn't feel urgent to me.
Right.
And now, especially during COVID, when you're realizing that like, oh, you can't get certain food in groceries in the grocery store because no local farmers are growing it and providing it to the grocery stores. Everything's being flown in, and now we can't fly things in. What are we gonna eat? I have to pay $8 for eggs. What are we gonna do? Like, people are having these conversations now, and now these things feel less urgent. Now it's like, oh, well, if North Carolina was growing more than just tobacco, soybeans, and cotton, we might have things to feed the state. And you know, like you said, if Minnesota farmers who are doing that farming had the resources to do that, then it might actually provide the food that people need, as opposed to the big industries that only grow the same 2 or 3 crops in each state. It's just not realistic or sustainable, and it's also just not how the land is supposed to be. And so that's also where I think I've been, like, when I set out to write the book, it was always about the economics. It was, I want to make the case for reparations because so many people talk about reparations as this pie in the sky thing, and I want us to get to a place where we see it as there's no way we can achieve racial justice without it. Like, I want people to see that after reading the book. We have to do land back for Indigenous Americans. We have to do reparations for Black Americans. Otherwise, we are going to stay in the revolving door. But I was so focused on the monetary value. And whenever I interviewed Black elders, they were always like, there's so much we lost when we lost land. Like, my grandmother was saying, like, yeah, growing up, everyone grew their own food. And you'd go to your neighbor's house when you needed eggs because you didn't have enough. Not because they bought eggs from the store, but because they had chickens. And like, everyone grew their own food and had the livestock and had the whatever. And everything was fresh. And now you pay a premium for organic. And you don't even know if it's actually organic. It's like, I think this still has chemicals in it, but it just looks shinier. And like, you use more dyes maybe. Like, you don't even know where it's been grown. And we're paying so much more for the bad food. Like, they're doing autopsies on people and finding plastics in our blood from like, it's just mind-blowing to and scary. And people are getting sick younger and younger. My best friend got diagnosed with a rare form of blood cancer at 26. And she only did that because she went to get a COVID test, and they were like, something else, it's a full physical. Like, it's just, all of these things are so interconnected. And I started writing the book again because the more that I talked about it, the more I felt like that conspiracy theory meme with the like whiteboard. But like, it really is so interconnected. And if we want to increase public health outcomes and like make more positive health outcomes for Black people while addressing racial wealth gaps, while telling the truth about history, reparations is the like magic answer. The Venn diagram all overlaps right there, and anything else is going to be a nice Band-Aid fix.
You know, but what you were saying, owning land is supposed to be about enjoying of the land, not owning land to have to worry about business and keeping up with this political system that's going on, this corporate system that's in place that's really running everything. You know, that's sad. Like you said, people, we supposed to have land and grow and do our own thing and trade and barter or whatever we supposed to do. Not worry about mortgage, paying taxes every year. Why do you have to pay taxes? You own land, but you have to pay taxes every year. That's their way of you really don't own the land. You know, then they come back, what you say, what is that, they can take it,
Eminent domain.
Eminent domain. Like, what? They making up all of this as they go to try to still have control. First, I thought the government's supposed to not have control over all the lands, but then they come up with a way to say eminent domain or this or that, to say, you know what I mean?
So true.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just saying, I know it's but I just have to be honest, because we have to understand what we going through is still colonization. It's still from colonization, and that's what it is. They take your land and they don't want you to have, listen, I'm just saying like this because you have white people saying, oh, black people gonna take over. Why do anybody have to take over? Why come people just can't get their land, get here or get there and live with your people and live in peace? Why do somebody have to be over somebody else? I'm just not understanding that. People can't live in peace. You know, but that's just the problem, and that's just
I was
what
about to
we need
say,
to
yeah.
come about it.
It's this idea of, oh, you're gonna do to me what I know that
Yeah.
my ancestors did to yours. And that's also why I could talk about in the book, like, my answer is not black capitalism or any idea of we're taking over, but I'm not gonna fall for the, like, even entertaining the idea that we can't give black people what is owed because we're afraid that they will get revenge. It's like, if we are having a truthful conversation, I don't need to be angry and revengeful at you. But the anger grows when we continue to deny the justice and the tension that we feel, and people think that, oh, the more that we do, the worse it's gonna get, and it's like, no, it's the more we avoid it, the worse it gets. And when we do the public education so that those who have the wrong, mindsets and frameworks around this can unlearn that and relearn it or whatever, but like to dissipate the pain and trauma that is felt amongst black and indigenous communities requires a repair. There's so much that was taken, and there's so many people, even, this is the last thing I'll say, I know we gotta get to like larger questions and signing and stuff, but so most of the book I write about my father's side of the family who has land in North Carolina, because we still have some of that land, even though a lot of it was taken. But I didn't even know until writing this book that my mother's side of the family used to have land in Kentucky. I only knew that my family lived in Ohio. And I was interviewing my maternal grandfather, and he said, his dad, so that would be my great-grandfather, used to have land with his family in Kentucky. And the process at the time was sort of like, if you cleared the land and could harvest on it, it was yours, which is its own anti-indigenous mindset. But that was the policy. And what black people would do is go out there and, like, from other states, go to Kentucky, clear land, and then they'd be killed and the land would be taken from under them. And so the policy, what black people had told each other was, you gotta be able to defend your land. It's not just, like, even if it's yours, even if you have a deed, even if you cleared it, you have to be able to defend your land. And one day, my great-grandfather had left, and it was just his mother on the land by herself. And a group of white men came and beat her up, and they thought they left her for dead. She was barely living when her sons came home, and when they nursed her back and asked who did this, and she was able to describe them, my great-grandfather killed the person who had beaten his mother. And they immediately, like that day, had to flee the state and had never been back in Kentucky. I never knew. And then I was able to corroborate that story because I'm like, I've never heard this before. I look at census records. In the 1920 census, we're in Kentucky, Newcastle. In the 1930 census, we're in Dayton, Ohio. The land that was ours, someone else's now. And he's never been back there. In Cleveland, Ohio, 2 days ago, I was just there doing a book tour, and my cousins from Ohio came out. And these are my second cousins, but cousins are cousins. And I didn't know that they didn't know the story. And I'd asked my aunt who came to read the passage, and she's reading the passage, and my cousin is in the back just boo-hoo crying. And afterwards, I'm like, are you okay? I didn't realize you didn't know. And she's just like, I've been carrying so much anger, asking God, why would you put me in this state, in this family, to be poor and black, and my brothers are in and out of jail, and I got all these kids, and I can't pay for stuff, and I can't afford it, and why would you put me on this earth to just struggle? And then she was like, and I blamed my family, and I blamed the people around me, like, why would I be born into this circumstance? And then hearing the story made her feel both sad but proud, like, I do come from good people that had bad things happen to them, but it's not that I came from people who didn't have the ambition to own something, but it's just that every time the ambition gets pulled out from under you, and your grandkids don't even know the story. Like, I knew, like, my great-grandfather lived until he was 96 or 97. We all knew him, had pictures with him, he would play saxophone for us, all that. And he had never sat and really told us the story. I had to hear it from my grandpa. And then she had to hear it from my book. And all of the hurt that she had been feeling was realizing, like, I'd been blaming my mom, blaming my, like, why be born into these circumstances, and then realizing, like, I mean, still, why be born into these circumstances, but it's not right. It was this, it's like, it was like almost in that moment, like, unlearning the shame.
Right,
Like, she had been,
exactly.
like, feeling ashamed that, like, the people around me didn't want more for themselves.
Right, yeah.
And that's not what it was at all. It was
Right.
the people around them wanted it so badly and just could not go up against the larger system that we.
Yeah.
And that's how so many of us are feeling. Like, you told your story of the taking advantage of the, increasing the rent rates and so the more, like, so many of our families carry these stories, and so many of our elders blamed themselves. And always were just like, I was the weak link, or though that person was a weak link, or and it's like, no, we didn't do it.
Right.
And if we can free ourselves from that and and truly believe that, then we can embrace these policies, not from a place of, I need the handout, but I deserve what would have been my birthright.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Yeah, we have to free ourselves from this system. That's the only way that we can do that.
That is true.
I wanna check on time.
Yeah, we can do a couple questions or just open it up for discussion. Like,
Zoe, do you have a question?
Well, I guess it was just more of like a kind of a comment about, in so many spaces, policy spaces, talking to the University of Minnesota, cause they get a bunch of money for agriculture reason. They're also, like, most of the other universities in this country got stolen land, and then they had, based on the land value, they, like, had all this money, you know? But, like, we've heard so many times people say, oh, well, we understand that black people don't like farming because of, like, the whole slavery thing. And, like, no. What black people didn't like was slavery, and, like, that's, like, don't conflate both of those things together. And black African people have beautiful histories of agriculture and cultivation,
Yeah, we all
and
farms,
we
so
need more of those things for the young people today who are like, hell no, I'm not gonna farm, because we're trying to, encourage more young people to think about cultivation, land ownership, things like that, like, yes, like, growing food and or hemp, cannabis, like, whatever, is a beautiful thing. It is in our ancestry. Being connected to the land is a beautiful thing, and let's not fall into other people's narratives about us and whether or not we like agriculture. Like, part of the reason that we were taken from Africa is because white people were like, oh wow, those people cultivate rice, they cultivate all of these incredible crops
already,
and we want to steal them and make them do that for us here. And so it was just like kind of a commentary about how to change some of the like harmful narratives that are really like widespread and used a lot about like, oh well, reparations for the land, and like black people don't want to be back on farms and stuff like that.
Though, like, yes to everything you said, and it is an internalized thing. There are a lot of young people who do feel that way.
Yes.
And I do talk about this in the book because I'm forgetting his name, but someone coined it as anti-agricultural backlash. But I do think there's this association of anything agricultural with slavery. And I'll give a few examples. I got married to my wife.
Yeah.
So this is my wife's cousin, Brea. She also, we have the same name. So my wife and I got married on my family's land in North Carolina. And my family's land, specifically the area where we got married, is just, all you see is like a sea of soybeans in the back, because that's what was growing at the time. And then we pitched like a white tent up there. And it was very like, natural environment. It was just a green field with a white tent. No colonial architecture at all. And people still were like, did you get married on a plantation? And I'm like, why when we see a field, is that always plantation? Like, there is a difference, because there are the plantation weddings, but like a plantation, I associate at least with like, at least a big house on a hill. Something that, like some sort of big structure that feels colonial with the wraparound porch and some sort of, like, there was none of that in any of the photos and any of the imagery. And so that was a moment when I was like, why did your mind go there first? And why, when you see a verdant field, do you not first see the field and what is growing there? And so like that is a thing that I do think is associated. Other instances, it's just more like cultural examples. So my family eats chitlins. I don't know if everyone here knows what those are, but they are essentially pork intestine. And we eat them fried and we dip them in apple cider vinegar. And that is a recipe that my great grandma Martha got from her grandfather, a plumber. Like, we bring it out at special holidays, and it's like a baby's born, and it's like, all right, we gotta do chitlins. It's like, it's a delicacy for us. But being from New York, when I would say that, even to other Black people, that's slave food.
Right.
And it's like, okay, not every practice that is passed down from the 1800s is but only because of slavery. We were always sustainable people. If Black people were going, historically, if we were going to butcher an animal, we were going to use every part of an animal. We were never going to say, I want the bacon and the ribs, but throw away all other parts of the animal. We were always sustainable people that used every aspect. The bones were going to be turned into some sort of tool. The intestines or whatever were going to be a delicacy. And then what you really did not eat was still going to in some way nourish the soil and come back and help and nourish. And so we were eating chitlins and probably would have been outside of the context of it being the scrap meat that were handed down, but still that's associated. And so I literally have friends to this day who are like, girl, I'm not gonna be woke enough for that. I'm like, I'm not saying you have to eat it, but to like talk about it in that way is actually like subtly anti-Black. And we don't say it? No, actually, I was about to say tripas, tacos, like there's every other culture. We lived in Singapore for a year, Maddie in the back. And in Singapore and in a lot of East Asian cultures, there are lots of stews that have various different types of, so it's just like, yeah, but why when Black people have these practices, they're slave food, it's it's this thing. So I think there is this need to like not label anything that is from the South as backwards and slavery driven. And even then the last thing I remember seeing like a meme on Twitter that was like, would you pick cotton for $100 an hour? And the people in the comments being like, I never. And it's like, there is a difference between being forced to pick cotton and being paid to pick cotton.
Right.
I would pick cotton for $100 an hour is not forced labor.
Right.
That is great work.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, if I needed $100 an hour,
Yeah.
that could be great work.
Yep.
You'd go to McDonald's and make $7 an hour before you do that for $100, and like that, those being things. So I think there are great organizations that are trying to build those connections, and to your point, I think they're, like you and like your, sorry, my 9-month-old gave me his germs before I left for the tour. But yeah, there are lots of great organizations, Girl Trek, Hike Club, Brown Girls Climb, that are like trying to reconnect Black and brown people to nature, and to stop thinking of it as white people things. Like, I grew up thinking like, oh, skiing, fishing, doing some of these things felt not what I was supposed to do.
By design.
And then, exactly,
Yep.
and then you
I was
realize
about
it's
to
by
say that.
design, and then you reclaim it, and then you realize this is what we've always done, and I don't need to learn that from anyone else. Like, I don't, like, I really dug into that. Like, I don't need to learn sustainability from the federal government or from anyone but my ancestors, who always were reduce, reuse, recycle people. Like, without that being a thing.
So many good examples of like mutual aid groups and like collectivity, and I feel like we know that stuff, but
Yeah.
we have many examples.
Yeah.
I just wanted to piggyback. I'm sorry, y'all.
No, please.
I just want to piggyback off what she said about us being disconnected. Like you said, all this is by design. This is why they call our neighborhoods the concrete jungles. They intentionally disconnect us from nature, and then they have everybody else around. They will make a lake for people to have and be around water. They have grass, but you go up in our neighborhoods, they don't want us to have no yards, no grass, just sidewalk. And we understand what the concrete jungle term came from.
Yeah.
That like you said, it's by design. They disconnect the people that's really connected to nature from nature.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. So true.
So I have a question about, it's like a mix of what you're saying about the discourse around the past and today, and and that disconnection, you know, rewording of history is what I like to call it. It's
Yeah.
like a new level of revisionism for all of us. And that notion of a fear of reparations because it represents if we give you that, then you're gonna do to us what was done to you. Right?
Yeah.
And in a sense, also what we actually are observing is whatever has happened to us or the people who have been targeted
Yeah.
is actually also happening to those who were positioned to be participants. I think when I walked in, you were talking about using one to oppress the other,
Yeah.
crabs in a barrel kind of thing. So where that can happen within a specific group, it's also happened between poor blacks, poor whites,
Yeah.
middle class blacks. You know, that
Yeah.
that is ongoing along with this language change. And how can we reframe? Not that I want this to be anyone's job. There's no way that we can further the notion of justice for us without including those who feel like they will be reprised upon as liberation for them as well.
Yeah.
And what's happened to their children. So the same ways that they talk about mostly the trauma being around being enslaved,
Yeah.
the actual property loss was during apartheid. Why do we call it Jim Crow? It's called apartheid. That's what all the other apartheids would say.
Yeah.
So how do we reframe these narratives so that it is justice for all, and to use that as resources to fund our collective movement to save all of our children?
Yeah.
Because we will not, in this context, in this country, with the way that rhetoric is used and divisive, you know, narratives around history, people are truly living in siloed realities
Yeah.
at this stage
Yeah.
while experiencing and talking about the exact same thing.
Yeah.
There's no way that I think we'll be able to progress in this without having a discourse where our justice is linked to their liberation.
Yeah. So that was so beautiful. Wow, y'all are all really brilliant. I feel like we just had a round table, honestly. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think what I hope is that conversations around reparations for Black Americans inspire other conversations, and that's historically what has always happened. Now what I hope though is that Black people don't get left behind in that, because that's also what historically has happened. Black people fight for affirmative action for Black people. Affirmative action benefits white women more than any other group, but then it becomes this like all people of color. That's even started to happen to Juneteenth. Like I've seen people talk about Juneteenth as like a time we celebrate generally racial justice. I'm like, no, this was a specific holiday about a specific group of Black enslaved people and them specifically being freed, specifically later, specifically after, like all the specificities. And so my hope is that what we can get to is always acknowledge the shared histories, and that at the end of the day, most oppression in this country boils down to either patriarchy or white supremacy, or how either of those two things can profit, so like capitalism. And I genuinely believe that any conversation we have, if we're talking about water quality, if we're talking about abortion access, if we're talking about gun violence, if we're talking about education, if we're talking about policing, they all boil down to one of those three things. And that means that if we just tackle if we tackle those at the core and at the roots, then we will get at everything else. But I think that we have to be able to start somewhere. And historically, this country has not ever wanted to start with Black Americans. Even though all of the profit that this country has built has always started on our backs. And so I believe that what, in my best case scenario, we start with reparations, which necessitates land back, which then has people saying, well, if we can afford reparations and land back, we should be able to afford this. And it's like, and we can. And we could.
There's
Like,
literally
like,
that much wealth.
yes, there's literally
so
that much.
wealth.
Like that's why I'm like, when people have the bad faith arguments, I'm like, keep them coming, because then if you start talking about poor white people, I'm like, yeah, guaranteed income, let's do it. Yeah, universal health care, student loan debt, like, there's no gotcha for me. We should keep going. We should, like, there should be never-ending programs until everyone has everything that they need, and we can all work like 15-hour work weeks, and the robots are doing the work that, like, actually should be automated, so we can all be creative and stuff. But, like, we don't need, like, people working like 20-hour shifts in factories when robots can do that. But we should absolutely be able to maintain the livelihoods and the, like, you know, what comes from that should be able to fund all of the rest. The surplus allows for us to have a better quality of life. So I definitely believe that it all hopefully would feed each other, and that we keep realizing that the more programs we fund, the happier people are, the healthier people are, and then the safer we are, because we're least safe when people are desperate around us. When the people around us have very little is when we feel the least safe. Is when we're like, oh my God, they want what I have, because they have so little.
Right.
But if everyone has enough, then we're kind of really only left with the true psychopathic behavior. But, like, we have eliminated survival crime though, and I think that's important, because a lot of crime right now is survival crime. Is I need to feed people at home, and stealing this and being able to sell it, or stealing this and bringing it to my house is better than leaving it there. And even if I have to put my life at risk and your life at risk, the chance of being able to change my life is worth that. That's how desperate people are right now. And that's why we have a lot of the issues we have, and we're not gonna get out of that by forcing larger racial wealth gaps, forcing greater depravity, forcing larger, like, it's only gonna increase the tension. So I hope that we start to all see the same enemies, and I think that has happened. The union strikes of last year have really ignited that, from Hollywood to Starbucks to teachers to nurses. Like, everyone believes that our workplaces and our livelihoods can be better, and I think we're getting to the point where people are sick and tired of being sick and tired, so.
I was gonna ask if you had read the Some of Us, that book by
Heather
Heather
McGhee.
McGhee. She really talks about, like, she's a Black economist, and she's like, I don't understand how poor, when they teach us in school, in college, in, you know, economics, that people will act in their best self-interest, right? But we have so many examples where poor white people and or, you know, white immigrants came in, assimilated, and even though they had more in common with poor Black people than they did rich white people, they held on to that, and they went without themselves. She uses the, like, example of the public pools that they built, like, tons of public pools in, like, the 30s and 40s, and then when they forced, like, racial integration and said, like, okay, Black people get to use these public pools too, white people, you can't just, like, run Black people off.
We should put concrete in those pools.
They drained 90% of the pools that were created were drained and filled up with dirt. White people would rather not have access to the pool themselves than swim with Black people.
Same with public schools.
Yeah, and so she talks about that, like that racism, you know.
So self-destructive.
Right, it's for everybody, and the whole, like, this zero-sum game, like, well, if we give, you know, there's a small amount of resources, if we give Black people these things and they're stealing, then it's like stealing it from us.
But
They're
still
poor,
they're
but
white,
people
but
who
that
are
means
already
they don't
using
have
it.
it either. So what they are actually offering is aspiration.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a publicity, it's an ad that they never actually get. So it is still this perception, this notion of perception, and being co-opted to be the other crab in the barrel. Cause maybe one day you too can be
Even if
Elon
you've
Musk.
never seen that, even if you've never seen proof that some, you know, your neighbor is poor in Alabama, a white person, who has seen that where they actually get that American dream, you know what I mean?
But
But
that's
it's like,
the
right,
church says.
it's what they sell.
I've never seen Jesus, but do you believe in Jesus? You know?
Yeah.
It's kind of like if you're from a scarcity mindset and you have been taught that this is not scarcity, I'll give it another name. You're a rich person in waiting.
Yes.
And this is what you have to go through in order to be a rich person. How do we shift the perception by, like, that for me, is liberation for your average white person. I think there's a guy who wrote Memoir of a Klansman, where he researched his family and found his, ancestry as a Klans person, and he calculated that of all of the white people here today, at least half have family members who were members of the Klan. I would suggest, is this before apartheid or after apartheid? Because the white people came afterwards, they shouldn't count in that number, So, I mean, that's a lot of people who have to pretend or efface their history to just not deal with it. And while we're at it, let's just stop talking about history at all in school.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
it's attacking
not do
education
it.
is the key to
They
helping
don't
people
wanna-
not see
But
it.
that's
People to be
shame.
uncomfortable
But that's
about
perception.
it. Yeah.
But that's perception. Like, how do you get off the perception train unless they're offered this liberation, which is also our justice?
Yeah.
Like, I just don't see that interconnectedness. I just don't see how we get off of that. And
It's
the
so,
belief
I mean,
in
we could
minority
literally
rights.
talk about this all day, cause it's so powerful, but as you said, perception is really tied to everything. I mean, they literally talk about the American dream, the idea that we can all one day be a millionaire or a billionaire is what keeps the pyramid scheme going. Because everyone's willing to do the grunt work, hoping that they will be the I got a golden ticket person. And land is a big part of that, because even now, like, the only real shot, and like millennials and Gen Zers is like, if you can maybe be one of the few people to still get a house at a decent price and hope that it exponentially goes up the way that it has, so that we can get that boomer blessing of I bought a house at $150,000 and now it's worth almost $1 million. Like, but it's just the chance that will happen for us is because we're buying the houses at already $500,000.
Right.
If you can buy one. And so we're coming in so late in the game, trying to be a part of those who profit from it, and it's just many of us will never, like many of us will never get that, but our belief in the power of it is what keeps the power going. So we can, I mean, I know we gotta go. I'm excited. We'll keep talking though at the signing table for sure. But I love everything that y'all brought and the other books that we're introduced to, because I don't believe that Rooted should exist in isolation. I hope that Rooted is a book that helps us expand our visions of anti-racism and recognize that what we believe to be things that would achieve racial justice are often only like corners of the conversation, and to truly address all of these things requires a more comprehensive discussion of all of the things: perception, ambition, how wealth is hoarded, how they convince us that there's not enough to go around, and yet the Pentagon continues to lose billions of dollars, and yet we continue to send billions to other nations annually, but there's never any money for the things that we need, for the communities that we're in. And I hope that we continue to push back against that locally and federally, because reparations is not something that only needs to happen like we need a president to sign something. There's so many local initiatives. Oftentimes a local government took land through eminent domain, and a local government can give it back. And so we can fight for that wherever we can, and I hope that y'all feel pushed to do it too. But thank y'all for coming out. Appreciate you.